Hi, listeners. Thanks for joining in. Welcome to another HRO Today Educational Podcast. In this series, we aim to provide you the latest workforce management approaches and best practices in HR. I'm Debbie Bolla, Vice President and Editorial Director of HRO Today magazine. Quiet quitting. It's the latest buzzword in HR, but it's certainly one you don't want to hear around your organization. It's when employees are disengaged at work, and unfortunately, recent Gallup research reports that 50% of the current workforce are quiet quitters. So what is HR to do? How can leaders spot quiet quitting or prevent it from happening in the first place? Luckily, I have an expert here with me today to answer these questions and more. Jason Krumwiede serves as Executive Vice President of Broadleaf. With 20-plus years of recruiting and outsourcing industry experience, Jason has been instrumental in the further development of Broadleaf's RPO practice. As Executive Vice President, he focuses on business growth, solutions design and innovation, and service excellence. Thanks, Jason, for joining me today. Can you start by telling our listeners a little bit more about quiet quitting?
Hi, Debbie. Thrilled to be here today with you at HRO Today to discuss the background of quiet quitting and the impact it's having on corporate America, offer up a few creative ideas for our listeners to get in front of this topic and to help them going forward. I thought I'd break it up into three different buckets. First, just share my perspective on this social phenomenon. Two, a little bit of history for the listeners. And then three, frame it up in a term that's been used a lot in the past with presenteeism, which is a term that's been used over the years to more or less describe what's happening with quiet quitting. I love the fact that this has come up. A few months ago, we're learning about it from our employees, understanding their perspectives. They're telling us from both sides of the coin about how they feel about it. It's a little bit of a quiet rebellion. We're not going to take it anymore. I grew up in the 1980s, MTV music video culture. Dee Snider, who's from Twisted Sister, pounding his fist and banging his hair, that we're not going to take it anymore. And I think there's an element of that within quiet quitting. But essentially, it's a response by young professionals about the hustle culture and that business is good and that we must work all day, every day to pursue our career goals because there's more money to make. There's a promotion on the horizon. It's that bigger, better deal that's really part and parcel of our culture. I think what's interesting is it's a lot of elements that we're talking about every day within our organizations. It's an intersection of engagement or disengagement, work-life balance, wellness, mental health, pandemic exhaustion, the great resignation, and it's all rolled up into one hashtag quiet quitting. What's interesting is there's a recent survey from Gallup that states disengagement globally is costing organizations about $8 trillion a year. I don't know where they get the $8 trillion, but that's a super big number. When you break that down, about 60% are emotionally detached of the folks they surveyed. About 20% are rated themselves as miserable. 33% are engaged. So you can see roughly 80% are not in a very good state and want to talk about it. So that's kind of how I frame things up. Now, going a little bit into the history, I'm sure many of your listeners know this already, but it's a TikTok phenomenon, about a 15-second video from a software engineer. He had heard about this idea of quiet quitting and just did a quick post. And what he says is, I recently learned about this term called quiet quitting, where you're not outright quitting your job, but you're quitting the idea of going above and beyond. And he continues, you're still performing your duties, but you're no longer subscribing to the hustle culture mentality. And I think that's what really caught everybody's attention, is that hustle culture mentality that I think is super prevalent in our workplace, especially in the States. And then he goes to say, it's not your worth as a person is defined by your labor. And so that's really where it all started. With TikTok, it's the pile-on effect just with that statement caught fire. I think many hundreds, thousands, millions of people felt the same way in terms of just stating that. And how I've seen it described, too, is it's starting to become a philosophy that it's more focused on the bare minimum of doing your job. And I don't subscribe to the bare minimum. I think people are hardwired differently, and I think it can be framed up in a little bit different manner. My third is around presenteeism. I had this conversation probably about 3 or 4 weeks ago with some colleagues, and we were talking about it and how do we address it with our employees, with our teams, with our colleagues. And I said to them, I'm dating myself, but this is really about presenteeism. Presenteeism is really about working while you're sick and not being able to be productive. So it could be sick, meaning I just don't feel well and I'm not as productive, but many workplace cultures have this focus on I have to be at the office all the time and I have to outwork my boss. And that can lead to exhaustion, to stress, to being overworked, other conditions that really have a negative impact on somebody's well-being as well as productivity. Other motives that drive that is the culture of I can't afford to take the time off. It was very prevalent during the pandemic. I can't afford not to work. There's this organizational citizenship, which is I get admiration from my colleagues by being there all the time and leaving after my boss. The third motivation is career advancement, which I think that's really what the TikTok video is getting at, is this hustle culture mentality. And so presenteeism is, I haven't really seen it brought up, but it's certainly part and parcel of hashtag quiet quitting and what's happening in workplaces across America.
Those are some good points. Now, you mentioned it's derived from a combination of many things like disengagement, work-life balance, mental health, overall exhaustion. So what are some signals HR leaders can look for that it's occurring?
Quiet quitting is less around an employee's willingness to work harder, and I think it's more around the manager's ability to develop those deep relationships with their colleagues, with their team members, day in and day out. Interesting poll from SHRM. They did this quiet quitting survey on who are the most effective leaders and the least effective managers in their organizations. A couple really interesting points. Highly rated managers in the survey, so this is of their direct reports, only about 3% quiet quitting. The lower or least effective managers were rated at 14% of their teams were quiet quitting. So a significant 3 to 4x than their counterparts. I think the other really interesting point is giving the extra effort, which again ties back to the hustle culture, is 62% were giving the extra effort for highly rated managers, whereas lower rated managers were about 20% in terms of their direct reports giving that extra effort. One of the things at Broadleaf, which is we've always been a virtual culture, and I've said to our CEO, I think this is a strength, and I think this is also our weakness too. So when we were coming into the pandemic, this was very natural for us to move into going all remote. We have some core centers in our offices in Buffalo that we had to move offline, but it was pretty seamless for us to move that way. And what I mean, it's a strength because we could do that very easily. And it's a weakness because we do have an office environment, but about 85% of our colleagues work remotely across the U.S. and Canada. And so some signals that we really focus on when we look at quiet quitting is we use Teams and Zoom all the time. So when we have our meetings, is their camera turned off? And is it pretty frequent? I know from working with some of my leaders on my team, like we look at that and we start to measure like, this person hasn't really been on camera for a little bit. Do you think we should have a conversation? And maybe there's something there that we want to unpack and talk a little bit further. A change in behavior, so uncharacteristically they're quiet or more withdrawn, especially via video. So I think those visual cues are super important. On video, you can see each other and you can see those facial expressions. Are they distracted or look tired? A fourth one is around one-on-ones, and I've coached my leaders around, are your one-on-ones getting a little bit flat? Do they not have the same level of energy that they did before when you're talking about, let's say, key aspects to support a client or key initiatives or projects that they're looking to drive? And elements like that is really important. One interesting thing when I was doing some research for this was an executive coach was talking about this phenomenon, and she said, she didn't really care for the term quiet quitting. She preferred the term carefully coasting. I didn't know how to take that. I almost prefer the term quiet quitting as opposed to carefully coasting. But The element, especially of being a manager, recognizing those behavioral and visual cues on how a person is interacting is so vital to make sure that you're getting in front of and addressing the issue.
You said earlier that Gallup reports quiet quitting can cost a shocking $8 trillion to businesses. So what steps should organizations take to combat it?
It's a really huge number, and I think there's several things that organizations can do to address it. I know from Broadleaf's perspective, listening sessions are really important. And one of the things that we put in place about a year ago was flexible work hours. And so I think we've seen how important that is to colleagues and team members to have the flexibility to skip the commute, to work from home, to change up work hours, whether it's start times or end times, can really make a difference in their well-being, productivity. LinkedIn had a really interesting survey about flexibility in job postings and how companies communicate that to attract candidates into their organization. And what they saw from 2019 till now, about a 350% increase in the number of mentions from company posts with the term flexibility. They've also seen a 35% engagement rate as well with companies that are mentioning flexibility. So we know flexibility is extremely important. We also know that CEOs, especially today, are on opposite ends of the spectrum. Many CEOs are like, we need people in the office. That's how we work. That's how we get our best work done. And it's really important to she or he. On the other side, other organizations are, flexibility, remote work is here to stay, and meeting employees where they are in that journey. I'd say for Broadleaf, we're somewhere in between. We like to provide that flexibility. We've instituted a 4-day work week for some of our colleagues. Other colleagues come in once or twice a week. And then, as I said, 85% of our colleagues work remotely anyways. So having that flexibility is vital. Second is around creating shared experiences, and this really ties to culture, and it's super important for managers, and it's very difficult virtually to create those shared experiences with their team where they can have fun. I mean, lots of companies are doing virtual happy hours. It doesn't need to always be on the manager as well to think of those shared experiences. I've seen many of our colleagues come to me and say, hey, I really want to do this, and embracing that idea. Last week, we just had a virtual scavenger hunt with my entire extended team. Probably had about 25 of us on the phone all around the country. And this colleague created an entire virtual scavenger hunt for an hour during the middle of the day. And we're running outside in our houses, trying to find different items, and then coming back and telling a story about, what is the most impactful book that we've had, either personally or in our work lives, is one example of what we had to find a book in our house and then share the experience. So that's number 2, I think, is vitally important. 3 is around leaders helping their colleagues manage and sort through the work priorities. I've seen this myself in my direct reports, this feeling of being overwhelmed. And oftentimes they will get task after task from different leaders, especially if they're in a support position, that they've got to tackle all of these different projects. And so helping that person think through what's really a priority for the organization and what's not, because you can have this sense of everything is important and it really starts to weigh on you. And as an executive, helping that team member sort through the priorities and what's really important to drive our strategy. And then going back to, let's say, that person they support and say, this isn't really on the top of the list and we're going to move that to a Q1 project. And so that really is a big factor in helping a person manage through that. And I mentioned earlier, empowering your teams to be creative and do fun things ties back to those shared experiences. Number 1 thing on the agenda is talking about culture and what are the specific things that we're doing to impact our own culture to the benefit of our employees.
Right. And now what about talent attraction? How can attraction strategies have a positive impact?
Really good question. We're in a unique position at Broadleaf. We are a recruitment outsourcing, total talent, workforce solutions company. So we're very unique in our delivery teams. They actually have two employers that they need to serve, the clients that we support, and so we're representing their employment brand in the workforce. We're very much part and parcel. We adopt our client's brand. Our colleagues in delivery are supporting our client's brand. They're also part of the Broadleaf team as well. And so serving both of those cultures, sometimes having two bosses, one with a client, one with Broadleaf, developing those skills is something that we talk about when we're attracting people to Broadleaf, to really have that nimbleness and versatility and people who like a lot of different experiences in their workday and being challenged. That's really something when we're attracting people to Broadleaf that we really bring in how it's a different work experience to support clients in the recruitment outsourcing and MSP, managing a client's contract labor forces. Secondly is cultural adaptation, understanding the operating system, the values, and the communication. So when you're speaking to either our client that we're looking to attract talent to them or internally, talking about the operating system in really specific ways so they can truly understand what the culture is. The meaningful work is super important, having a strong company and financial backing, pride in our work and how we do it. Also, the benefits and impact that we can have on society. And I think, especially in the recruiting profession, we change people's lives. One of the areas that we've done from an attraction strategy is attracting people outside of the recruiting profession. A couple of good examples are we recently hired a teacher that was really just looking for something different as one of our talent scouts, so had no formal recruiting experience. And he was really attracted to the ability to impact people's lives by giving them work in a new job. Another person on one of our teams was a speech pathologist and just got worn out. And so that's another area of quiet quitting. I think with the pandemic, we've seen people either burnt out in what they're currently doing and want to do something different. I saw in some research about the workforce participation that's happening or lack thereof. Approximately 40% of people that are switching jobs are actually leaving the industry and going to a new industry. And we've seen with the people that we've attracted to our organizations and advised our clients that going outside the normal skill set, experience, education bias can really help and have a positive impact on your attraction strategies.
Going outside the traditional, that's some great advice. Thanks, Jason. Until next time, listeners, I'm Debbie Bolla.